Hello everybody, welcome back to my channel. This is going to be another video game video. It's also another list video because these are fun and people enjoy them. This is top 25 arcade games of all time. I tried to pick a variety of vintage, retro, and semi-modern arcade games. And I say semi-modern because they haven't really made anything of note since about 2001. You know, nothing worth my time. So this isn't going to have a lot of newer games. These are going to be a lot of 80s and 90s games for the most part, with maybe one or two from the 70s, possibly. But nothing really newer than that. So I'll just say it right now. No Dance Dance Revolution. I'm sorry. Alright, number 25 is a game from the 8-bit period of video arcades, and this is Double Dragon. Double Dragon is widely regarded as one of, if not the first, side-scrolling beat-em-up. Double Dragon was ported to the Nintendo Entertainment System, the Sega Genesis, and I believe there may have been a Sega Master System port and an Atari 7800 port, but do not quote me on that. I'm just going from memory, and my memory sucks. Number 24 is a boxing game. It's called Ring King. I believe this was by Data East. So, again, don't quote me on that. I played the shit out of this game in the arcade. This was a 2-button boxing game. You basically had left punch, right punch, and that was it. I think. Or it was punch and block. I don't remember. I haven't played it in years. There is an NES port of this game. You can check it out if you'd like. It's not as good as the arcade game, but, you know, they rarely are. There you go. Number 23 is Donkey Kong. Donkey Kong is one of the first platformer type games. It is not a side-scrolling platformer. It is not a vertical scrolling platformer. It doesn't scroll at all. It's a single-screen platformer. There were a dozen or so of these in the early 80s before Mario came along and opened up the world to side-scrolling multi-screen platformers, which the first was actually on the Atari 2600. This would have been Activision's Pitfall, but that's another story for another day. Donkey Kong is unique because it's the first game to feature the character of Mario, as well as Donkey Kong. It's also unique in that it's one of a handful of Nintendo published, produced, developed games that were available on non-Nintendo systems. You can get Donkey Kong on the Atari 2600. You can get it on Mac and DOS computers. You can get it on the Intellivision. You can get it on the ColecoVision. I believe you can get on the Atari 5200, but not the 7800, but the 5200, I think. Don't quote me on that. And I think you can get it on the Commodore 64, but I'm not 100% on that. So again, don't quote me. Next, number 22, Primal Rage. Primal Rage is a fighting game, a 2D fighting game that came out in, I believe, 1995, if I'm not mistaken. This uses claymation dinosaurs. So, yeah. And it does feature fatalities. So you can rip the head off or eat the heart out of, or whatever, of your opponent if you beat them. And it's a really fun game. Primal Rage was available on all the home consoles at the time. So Super NES, Genesis, 32X, Sega Saturn, Sony PlayStation, even on Atari Jaguar, and I think it was on Sega CD, but don't quote me on that. But I think it was, but I'm not 100%. Number 21 is Mortal Kombat. Mortal Kombat not only changed arcade games and fighting games as a whole, but it also changed video games in general. Like all video games. It forced the game industry, under threat of Congress, to implement the ESRB rating system. Mortal Kombat is not the first arcade game to use digitized graphics. It is not the first fighting game to have blood and guts in it, blood and gore in it. But it culminated in that because it was digitized graphics and bloody fatalities. So it was realistic looking blood for the time. Looking fatalities. And it's a hell of a lot of fun. It's a relatively easy fighting game compared to others. It's not complicated. There are no combos to learn. There are a few special moves to memorize. Fatalities as well. But you have to defeat 6 fighters. Your mirror match. You have 3 endurance matches. You have Goro and then the final boss. So, a handful of quarters ought to do it. Next up, we have Gauntlet. Gauntlet is it's a maze game, basically. But it's a fantasy maze game, so it's not necessarily... I mean, it's almost a dungeon crawler, but it's not necessarily a roguelike, so to speak. But it's similar. But Gauntlet is a 4-player arcade game, which was rare for the time. And you basically run around a maze, and you kill monsters. You hunt for treasure and keys. And once you find the key, you look for the exit, and you exit the level and move on to the next level. And that's pretty much it. Gauntlet was also available on home consoles at the time. Most notably NES, but also the Atari 2600. Number 19 is Centipede. Centipede is an early arcade game. It is more or less a Space Invaders clone. Basically, you have a gun that moves left and right, and you have an alien that comes down the screen, and you shoot the alien. Only it's a centipede instead of an alien. But it's basically at its core, it's the same game. It's just, in my opinion, Centipede is a little bit funner than some of those other games at the time. And it's definitely worth talking about. Centipede was also available on home consoles at the time. Number 18 is Pole Position. Pole Position is unique in that it was created by Namco, but they licensed it to Atari for the U.S. market, not just the home console market, but the arcades in America that were Pole Position arcades were manufactured by Atari, not Namco. So some people, older people, my age and older, remember Pole Position as an Atari game. Younger people know it as a Namco game. It's technically both. Both are accurate. So if you remember it as an Atari game, that is accurate. Even though it is essentially a Namco game. It's a racing game, basically. Number 17 is Bust-A-Move. Bust-A-Move is a puzzle game. So it's also known as Puzzle Bobble in some countries, but it's Bust-A-Move in the U.S. So that's what I'm calling it. That's what I played it as. Bust-A-Move, you have a screen full of colored bubbles, primary colors mostly, and then you have an arrow at the bottom. It's fixed in the middle, and it can move left and right. And you have a colored ball, and you aim the arrow at the colored balls, and you shoot the colored ball you have at the screen full of colored balls, and you match 3 or more colored balls, and they pop. And the goal is to clear the screen before the ceiling pushes the colored balls to the ground. That's your goal. It's a really fun game. I love Bust-A-Move. Number 16 is Space Invaders. Now, remember when I talked about Centipede? Space Invaders is basically Centipede, only a little bit better. Space Invaders has aliens marching left and right across the screen and a UFO that flies by every once in a while, and you just shoot them. And that's pretty much it. Space Invaders has been updated along the way to like Space Invaders 88, 91, etc., etc. But it's basically the same game. It was also available on home consoles at the time. Number 15 is Cubert. Cubert is hard to describe. It's not really a platformer. It's not technically a puzzle game, but it's a hybrid of both. You're on a pyramid of platforms, and your goal is to jump on each platform, and as you jump on the platform, it changes color. And so you have to jump on all the platforms before the monsters get you and throw you off or kill you. Or without falling off the edge, because you can fall off the edge if you jump in the wrong direction. Because it's semi 3D, sort of. Multi-directional at the very least. So, yeah, Cubert's a lot of fun. Cubert was also ported to home consoles at the time. Number 14 is one of the most popular video games of all time. You've played it. You probably have it on your phone. You probably have it on your PlayStation or Xbox. You probably have it on your Nintendo Switch and your Game Boy. You have this game. I guarantee you have this game. It's Pac-Man. This game is ubiquitous with gaming. This is one of the most popular video games of all time. The arcade game, obviously, is where it starts. Now, again, Pac-Man has a little bit of a history. Pac-Man was designed and published by Namco in Japan, exported by Midway in the US, and ported by Atari to home consoles. So you had 3 companies laying claim to Pac-Man. So if you were alive in 1982 and you played Pac-Man in the arcade, you knew Pac-Man as a Midway game. If you were alive in 1982 and you played Pac-Man at home on an Atari console, you knew it as an Atari game. And if you lived in Japan, you just knew it as a Namco game. Or if you're, younger than us, you know it as a Namco game. Pac-Man is a maze game. You got 4 ghosts running around the maze. You got a screen full of dots, and you got a little pizza pie running around eating the dots. If you eat the big yellow dot in the corner, you can eat the ghosts, and you get to chase the fruit that runs around the screen. It's a pretty fun game. Number 13 is T2 Judgment Day, Terminator 2 Judgment Day. This is kinda sorta misremembered as a light gun game. I say that because it's a machine gun that you point at the screen and you shoot the objects on the screen. But it's not a light gun. It's a pair of joysticks that work against each other. So it's kind of weird. It's not really a light gun. It's kind of hard to explain. But anyways, it's essentially a light gun game, even if it isn't technically a light gun game. T2 is one of the better light gun games out there, and it's one of the more memorable ones because Terminator 2 was a fan-fucking-tastic movie. And this was also ported to home consoles at the time, Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis most notably. Number 12 is Virtua Cop, another light gun game. Now, in the arcade, this one was a little bit more popular and notable than the home console version because it was only available for the Sega Saturn, which was largely considered a commercial failure in the US. So most people did not play this on home consoles. They played it in the arcade. So most people remember it as an arcade game. You're a cop and you're running around shooting bad guys. That's all there is to it. Number 11 is Cruisin' USA. This is another racing game. This is one of the better racing games. This one is one of the first, not the first. That would be actually even earlier than Virtua Racing. It would have been hard driving, maybe even earlier than hard driving. So it's not the first 3D racing game, but this one's notable because this game was actually designed with the Ultra 64 in mind. This was supposed to be a launch title for the Ultra 64, and if you're scratching your head, the Ultra 64 is what Nintendo called the Nintendo 64 before they released it. This game was designed and manufactured by Midway using Nintendo hardware, N64 hardware. So this is basically a Nintendo 64 game in the arcade. Basically, not technically, but that's essentially what it is. And it's a damn good racing game. It's one of the better racing games. Number 10, you have Soul Calibur. Soul Calibur is a 3D fighting game that uses weapons. It's the best 3D fighting game that uses weapons. Not the best 3D fighting game around, but it's a damn good game. Soul Calibur was only ported to one home console, the Sega Dreamcast. So this one's harder to find. But it's still a lot of fun. I enjoy Soul Calibur more than games like Tekken, Virtua Fighter, or even, what's the other 3D fighting game from the time? I can't remember. I can't remember. I just know those ones. I can beat Soul Calibur on a single quarter. I can't do that with any other fighting game. Number 9 is Galaga. Again, Galaga is more or less a Space Invaders clone, just more enhanced. But this is the culmination of Space Invaders. This is the last Space Invaders game you have before we advance to the next level, which are shoot 'em ups. So Galaga, Space Invaders, Centipede are proto shooters or proto shoot 'em ups. They're not technically shoot 'em ups, but the shoot 'em up game came about because of Galaga, Space Invaders, and Centipede Millipede. But Galaga is the best one out of all of them. Number 8 is Rampage World Tour. Rampage World Tour is the culmination of the Rampage franchise. This is Rampage at its best. This is where it's done right. This is a fun fucking game. You're a giant gorilla or a giant lizard or a giant... What's the other monster? Wolf, maybe? And you're destroying cities around the world. And it's hella fun. Number 7 is Joust. Joust is a combat game. It's kind of a primitive fighting game in a roundabout way, but it's more like, well, it's called Joust. It's jousting is what it is, essentially. You are on a flying bird with a joust stick, pole, or whatever it's called, and your opponent is on a flying bird, and they have a pole. And the goal is to stab your opponent, basically, before they stab you. And turn them into an egg. And then collect the egg. And then collect more eggs than your opponent does. That's the goal. Joust is pretty fucking fun. Number 6 is Super Street Fighter 2 Turbo. Without getting into HD remasters and remixes, etc., etc., in the arcades, this is the best version of Street Fighter 2 you can get. This is like the director's cut, the extended edition, with all the DLC. Fun fucking fighting game, great characters, great graphics, great locations, just fucking fun all the way around, and helped define the fighting game genre. Number 5 is another light gun game. Again, this is one of the better ones. This is called House of the Dead. This is another one that you most likely remember in the arcades, because the only home console version of it that exists, to my knowledge, is the Sega Dreamcast version. I believe there may have been a Saturn port in Japan, but don't quote me on that. So I'm not 100% on that. Either way, it came out at the end of the Saturn's life in arcades, so it would have been a rare title on the Saturn had it been on the Saturn. If it is, I don't know. But this is, nonetheless, it is an arcade game, and a damn good one. It's also not very long, so this one's easy to beat with a handful of quarters. Next up, the last light gun game to make the list, and the best of all the light gun games, the light gun of light gun games. This is Area 51. This is what you're looking for in a light gun game. you are a space marine running around Area 51 shooting aliens. And that's it. But it's damn good. And it's hella short, so this one's easy to beat too. Number 3, the original Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles arcade game. Not Turtles in Time. Don't even talk about Turtles in Time. That game doesn't exist. This is the one you want. This is the one that was ported to the NES as TMNT to the arcade game, which is a whole other story for another day. Number 2, the greatest fighting game of all time. Don't at me. Mortal Kombat 2. This is one of the greatest arcade games of all time. This game was ported to fucking everything it could get ported to. The entire reason people bought a 32X was to get this game in the best available home format at the time. This game sold systems. Not enough to make the 32X a successful product, but enough that it did drive the sales of the 32X. The sales that it did get were to people who wanted to play Mortal Kombat 2. Right here, myself included. I bought a 32X. The very first game I bought for it was Mortal Kombat 2. And number 1, greatest video game of all time, most successful video game of all time. Like I said, you have it on everything. You got it on your watch. You got it on your phone. You got handheld versions of it. It's on every game console you've ever owned. And you may not own it for every game console you've ever owned, but it is literally on every game console you have ever owned. This is Miss fucking Pac-Man. Now, Miss Pac-Man is especially unique because it's not a real game. Technically. It's a ROM hack of Pac-Man. That's all it is. It's literally a pirate ROM hack. The makers of Pac-Man caught wind of and decided to cut a deal with the hackers so that they could take copyright claim of Miss Pac-Man and make money off of it and let the hackers get, their 15 minutes of fame and, their small fortune. Miss Pac-Man is the greatest fucking, most addictive video game ever made. I could play Miss Pac-Man for hours a day and never get bored. It's just that fucking good. When I go into a bar, or an arcade, or a bowling alley, or a movie theater, or a shopping mall, or a place that I expect arcade machines to be, this is the first game I look for. This is my go-to game. I walk in, they have Miss Pac-Man, here's my quarters, drop them in. If they don't have Miss Pac-Man, well, shit. And then I look for something else to play. There you go. Stay cool.